Hi, Miri.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Miri Albahari from the Philosophy Department at the University of Western Australia. And you are in Australia, which may account for the fact that your picture is slightly, at times slightly blurry, but I think your audio is fine. So I think everyone will be able to understand what you're saying, at least in the technical sense. I mean, that said, we're going to be talking about some somewhat arcane things, and we hope people will be able to understand them in the conceptual sense as well. We're going to be talking about whether the self exists. You've written a book called Analytical Buddhism, which we see right here. And you get into this question of whether the self exists. Before we launch into this, I just want to quickly reassure people that this question, however arcane it sounds, does have some practical relevance. So, for example, when people who meditate are, kind of, you might say, changing their orientation to certain feelings and maybe ceasing to identify with some unpleasant feelings like anxiety, that's very much related to whether the self. The question of whether the self exists. The question of whether you want to own certain feelings is related. So there's a kind of a therapeutic relevance. There's also a kind of moral relevance. The question of how we treat other people, as we will see, is very much related to the question of whether we are these distinct, separate selves. So I want to promise people that there is a kind of practical payoff. Mm-hmm. But that said, let's launch into what is a pretty deep and arcane question of whether the self exists. And maybe we should start out by asking you how you became interested in this question.
I became interested in the question through becoming. I had a background. I grew up with parents who were always interested in Eastern philosophy and always discussing it. So that gave me always this background interest in Eastern philosophy. Then when I came to doing my PhD, I realized that, hey, why don't I do something on a topic that has interested me that I've never had the opportunity to take any philosophy courses on? And it just evolved. I first of all wanted to do something about Nirvana, the grand becoming enlightened and losing the sense of the self. But in order to cover that, I would first have to look at, well, does the self actually exist? What is meant by the self? And what is meant by the sense of self? And what is the difference between these two things? So that's how I became interested.
Okay. So you're suggesting there that there's a very close relationship between this question of whether the self exists and Nirvana, which is something everyone's heard of and presumably aspires to, because it's always described as, at least, in popular conversation, as this wonderful, blissful thing. And it is a real concept in Buddhism. It's something that supposedly is in theory attainable, although I think few of us can claim to have gotten very close to it. But anyway, there is a connection in your mind between this no self thing and Nirvana.
Yes, that's right. So Nirvana would be the first person realization directly that there is no self. That's how I would understand it. So how does a first person realization differ from a third person realization? So a third person realization might be the kind of thing that I was trying to do in my PhD thesis, which became the book. And so that is coming up with philosophical arguments scientifically buttressed by what does neuroscience, what does evolutionary science say, and then coming up using that empirical evidence to reason that there is no such thing as a particular self. And of course one would have to define the self that's denied. There's many different conceptions of the self. So it's only really denying one particular notion of self, and that's important. And so that's the third person, is this philosophical argument for it. And so one can have a fairly good grasp of that, but yet still have the sense of the self. Let still be nervous when giving a speech on there being no self, when talking about there being no self, and those nerves come from having a deep sense of the self, which is a deeply visceral, lived experience, a deep assumption that one is a thing of that kind. So Nirvana is the culmination of usually what is a very long practice towards undoing all those visceral, lived assumptions and emotions and attitudes and motivations which underpin the sense of the self, so that one doesn't just realize intellectually there's no self, but realizes it from a very deep and lived perspective. Okay. So that would be my take on Nirvana in relation to the sense of self.
Okay, so it's like the experiential realization of the truth of not self is what gets you to Nirvana.
Yes.
And as you suggested there, to do that would release you from all these unpleasant feelings, because they are bound up in the kind of experiential conviction that there is a self, in a way.
Yes, yes. So the unpleasant feelings, they come from what's known in Buddhism as Tanha. And there's several different translations of Tanha. The most common one is craving. But I prefer something like emotional investment in the satisfaction of desire, so that when things go one's way, one is happy. When things go badly, one is made sad. So one's emotions seesaw depending upon the contingent state of affairs. And so what I've argued in the book is that there is very close relation in Buddhism between Tanha and the sense of self, and I've tried to flesh out what that relation is. I think that the sense of self is partly constituted by this Tanha, this emotional investment. They are felt on behalf of a me and a mine. There's a lot of identification with things that one really cares about, so that when one pulls out the Tanha, gets rid of the root of this craving and identification, then that goes with, you're actually pulling up the root of the sense of the self. So they're very closely related.
Okay, and just to orient people, Tanha is identified in the Four Noble Truths as the source of dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, or sometimes like unsatisfactoriness. But anyway, dukkha is this thing we just as soon not have, and according to Buddhism, ordinarily pervades life, and the reason it pervades life is because we are prey to this thing called Tanha. But so that is said in the Four Noble Truths, but what is not so explicit is what you're talking about. At least in the Four Noble Truths, there isn't this explicit connection between Tanha and the sense of self. And I don't really know to what extent that does get made in other early Buddhist writing. But there is the sense that it is the source of delusion, or a source of delusion. And it is very clear that one of the key delusions, according to Buddhism, is the sense of self. But again, in the Four Noble Truths, you don't have this explicit connection between this Tanha thing and the sense of self. But in your interpretation, that is really fundamental, right?
It is fundamental. And sometimes, indeed, the Second Noble Truth, I've seen it phrased as the source of the dukkha, the suffering, is also delusion. So delusion and Tanha are two sides of the same coin. So Tanha is sometimes phrased as greed, hatred, and delusion. That sort of often kind of comes up in sort of Buddhist contexts. And the delusion is the delusion of self, the delusion that you can get satisfaction from things that are impermanent, and impermanence itself. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Is Tanha the greed part of that?
The greed, yes. Yeah, so the greed. Tanha is actually both greed and hatred. So the greed is the desire for pleasant sensations, whether through the five senses or what Buddhists also count as a sixth sense, which is the mind. And hatred is like the flip side of that. It's the aversion. It's sort of pushing away. I don't want that. So those are two aspects to Tanha. And then the delusion is if you didn't identify as a separate self who would be satisfied by these sense objects in the world, these pleasant, or dissatisfied by the unpleasant, if you didn't identify as a self, then you wouldn't have this greed and you wouldn't have this aversion. So they're like two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And the greed and the aversion feed the delusion of a self that can be made happy or unhappy, and the delusion of the self feeds the greed and aversion. So that's how it works.
So greed and aversion, and first of all, we should say that we don't mean greed just in a monetary sense. We mean greed in the broadest sense of clinging, wanting more, wanting stuff, and aversion is already appropriately generic in its sound. Well, I should say, you commonly hear the phrase greed, hatred, and delusion. A lot of people who have been to meditation retreats may have heard that phrase, but actually greed and hatred are probably meant more broadly than they may sound to people. Again, it's not just greed in the monetary sense, and it's not just hatred of like people and stuff. It's really aversion. It's like not wanting anything. It's like hatred of a bad taste or bad smell. It's just aversion.
It's like pulling up. It's like one of my pet examples is I'm driving. One thing that just infuriates me is really slow drivers, and so aversion is that just that feeling of even a slight irritation that arises at the slow driver.
It's just almost wanting things to be other than they are.
Exactly.
And so in that sense, greed and hatred, which are translations that crept into the literature, I don't know, a century or more ago, into the English translations, are in some ways misleading, and in some ways they give short shrift to how ambitious the Buddhist program actually is. That's right. It doesn't just want to liberate you from capitalism and hating people, the way you might think from greed, hatred, and delusion. It's like if you want nirvana, you're going to have to get over the whole business of wanting things to be a certain way, almost.
Yes. So on the very coarse level, it's like capitalism and hating people, but then it becomes progressively more refined, the states of the mind, until even if one becomes a very good meditator and one is getting these really deep absorption jhana states, which are incredibly blissful, there can be even greed for that. So there can be emotional investment such that one is made unhappy if one doesn't get a jhana state. So that's a version of greed as well. Right. So it can be incredibly subtle.
And just to be clear, before we move on to your whole idea about not self, is tanha, is that the word that is translated as greed? Or...
Yes, sometimes tanha is translated as greed. Or aversion is translated. Tanha is translated as aversion. It's usually the tanha covers the greed and aversion. Yeah.
Okay. Now on to your own view of, and here we're gonna start getting deep. I think. I think you think that a common approach, a common interpretation of the Buddhist doctrine of not self is wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the version that you think is wrong?
So the common version, which I think is mistaken, let me just start by saying that neither my interpretation nor the common interpretation are actually, as far as I've found explicitly in the Buddhist text, they're both interpretations. So the common interpretation is the interpretation of no self, which says that our nature, according to Buddhism, our whole psychophysical nature is exhausted by impermanent aggregates. So the impermanent aggregates are physical form, sensations to do with the five senses, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness.
And according to Buddhism, when you say exhausted by, you mean that's all there is. That's an exhaustive description of a person and a person's experience, right? I mean, everything about us falls into one of those five categories. It's consciousness, or it's perception, or whatever. That's the claim in kind of pretty early Buddhist philosophy.
Yes, and in particular, the contention is around the consciousness, because the way it's portrayed as one of the five khandhas is as something that is a discrete, a occurrence. It's an event that fleetingly comes and goes and then conditions the next consciousness that comes and goes and then comes and goes, so that consciousness conveyed as entirely impermanent. In my view, that's the Buddha, when the Buddha was talking about consciousness in that sense, it was in an object-oriented sense. But that didn't imply that the awareness, which is the common awareness, one can be aware of a sight, a sound, a smell, and so forth, that from one moment to the next, that the awareness is not discrete. So the common interpretation says that the awareness is discrete, the awareness of X is discrete from one moment to the next, awareness of Y, awareness of Z. Each awareness is discrete. But the way that I interpret it is the awareness aspect of the consciousness khandha actually doesn't come and go. What comes and goes are the objects towards which the consciousness is directed. And in that designation, consciousness is called impermanent. Okay. But so I think, in a sense, yes, we are the five khandhas, but I don't think that the consciousness khandha is thoroughly impermanent in the way I've described.
Okay, and let me pause and say that I think your view of this, before we elaborate on that, and people may not totally get what you're saying yet, but I think it helps solve a problem that I have in reading, say, the Buddha's first discourse on the not-self, where, as you say, he goes into these five aggregates, khandhas, skandhas, whatever. Yeah. Aggregates is the English term that supposedly constitute us. He goes through them. There's perception, there's this, there's that. And he tries to convince the monks he's talking to that they are not self. They are not part of the self. Now, he includes consciousness as one of the aggregates and says that is not self. And then he says, once you realize these things are not self and you don't cling to them, then you are liberated, or a monk is liberated, or something like that. And I'm thinking, like, wait a second, who is this, where is this you that is liberated? If even consciousness is not part of me, then what's left after liberation? How can there be anything left? And yet he's talking as if there's something left. And I've always thought, well, if there's anything left after you let go of, feelings and perceptions and the various aggregates, it has to be something like pure awareness or consciousness, right? And yet that's not said there. And so it's totally unclear what could be left to enjoy nirvana, right, so to speak. Although, of course, we shouldn't be enjoying things, I guess. Let's forget I said that. It complicates things. But I think you kind of have a way out of this problem, right? Because in your view, the Buddha would be fine with this notion of some kind of awareness that's not part of self, kind of, or do I have that wrong?
No, you're completely right. And it would be an impersonal awareness that's left. So there would still be, when one becomes liberated, it's not as if one ceases to experience the world. There still are the five aggregates arising and passing away, but without the tanha, without the delusion of self. So what the view that I don't have sympathy with, what they are saying is that that is all there is to the mind, is these impermanent arising and passing away aggregates, and to be unconditioned. They sometimes speak in the suttas of the mind of the arahant, the person who's enlightened being unconditioned, is simply to no longer have the disposition to be pushed around by greed, hatred, and delusion. That's how they understand the unconditioned. On my interpretation, all along our consciousness aggregate has had an unconditioned element. It was what I said before, is the awareness of element. And that is what becomes more, in a way, percipient after when one becomes realized. But it doesn't arise. That element doesn't arise and it doesn't pass away because it's not conditioned by time. If it arose, if that element of consciousness arose, that would make it something conditioned that comes and goes. But it's not something that does come and go. It's an element of our ordinary consciousness, which is just that pure, that sense of presence, that witnessing presence that neither arises nor passes away, and it is almost banal. It's so commonplace. It's hard to pin down, but that's the essence of my disagreement with the scholars on no self, is that the Buddha didn't explicitly talk, not explicitly about this kind of what I call this witnessing consciousness, but there are passages in the suttas where the Buddha does talk about a mode of consciousness which is unconditioned in this way. But there are only a few passages. It's not the focus of his teaching.
Right. And, okay, so a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you said that, okay, even after Nirvana, the contents of the aggregates, perceptions, feelings, and what mental constructions is one translation of one of the aggregates, they would persist, but they would no longer like have a hold on you. They would persist as witnessed things because your consciousness can witness things, but they would no longer be pushing your consciousness around.
Yes. So before, when one talks about the delusion, being subject to greed, hatred, and delusion, then the question arises, what is entangled? Just as you said before, what is liberated? Mm-hmm. There's something that somehow become confused and become mired in delusion, and it's that same thing that becomes liberated, unbound, and that is, I think, the essence of the mind, this kind of witnessing consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And it is well, let's get back to experience. Have you gotten very close to this experience yourself?
No, I will confess that I regularly go on meditation retreats, and I wouldn't be doing this whole project if I wasn't deeply interested in practicing myself. Mm-hmm. But I haven't. No, I've had very peaceful states, and I also, when I do go on longer retreats, I do have a much stronger sense of the witness consciousness. There's a much stronger sense of this, like a pure silence, like a silence behind, it's hard to describe it, a silence behind all the bombardment of the sounds, which just feels like a rock and unmovable and not coming and not going, and the emotions and the impingements on the world feel less like getting to the center, getting to me. So that's the extent of the experience which I've had. And the direct experience of witnessing, although I haven't experienced what the advanced states of objectless consciousness, which one would have to be a very good meditator to experience, I nevertheless, through my own practice and through mindfulness, do have a sense of this ever-present witness consciousness, and more so when I practice more.
Mm-hmm. And, well, yeah, I've done a meditation retreat, so I kind of know what you mean, although it sounds like you've gotten a little closer to Nirvana than I have, so congratulations on that.
I'm very far away.
And just out of curiosity, what's the longest retreat you've been on?
9 days.
9 days, yeah, that's what it is for me, and I keep aspiring to do more. It doesn't happen. So there's another, anyway, it's very pleasant, right? It's like when you're in this state, you're thinking, well, if I could sustain this, that would be great, presumably. And then it gets complicated when you get back to the real world. I'm curious, does it seem as if, in principle, if you could sustain it, you'd be able to function fine in the real world, and you'd still be an effective philosopher and everything. And is that your sense of things? That it's actually compatible with a day-to-day existence. It's just hard to sustain because it's hard to, for practical reasons almost.
Yes, I actually think I would do better. And this is the maddening thing, a crasia or weakness of the will, is that I directly experience everything being far clearer, more centered, and more efficient. The cognitive processes seem much more streamlined and more efficient after a retreat. Mm-hmm. My interactions are less frenetic. I don't get nervous like I normally do. So why don't I keep doing it? I think it's just what the Buddha said, like the causes and conditions. Just one moment of laziness leads to another moment of laziness, and then a distraction comes in, and then the greed comes in for a pleasant sensation, and then before I know it, the state fades away, and then I'm just back to spinning around on the wheel. And then I go on another meditation retreat, and then I keep mindful for another month, and then decline.
I'm familiar with this pattern. Okay, so there's another part of your argument here that where you think that, I mean, there's two different kinds of conceptions of the self that doesn't exist, right? There's what you call the bounded self, I think.
Yeah.
And you think it's the non-existence of that kind of self, and we'll explain what we mean here in a second. You think it's the existence of that kind of self that is really at the heart of Buddhist philosophy, properly interpreted. And then there's this other conception of the self that is I guess the bundled kind of theory of self in a way. Why don't you talk? Can you talk a little bit about this distinction?
In fact, it's the same conception of self. So what I argue is that there's, according to Buddhism, no such thing as a bounded, persisting, unified thinker of thoughts, owner of experience, agent of actions. But how this, and that it's an illusion, so that it appears to us as if we are such a self, implicitly appears to us, reflexively, as if we are such a self of that described bounded.
So like we're in control of things, and there's a continuity through time, and a coherence and everything. Okay.
Yeah, and that we identify as a thinker of thoughts, owner of actions, and so forth. But what's the difference between the bundle theory of self? Will say that what goes into making up that illusion is nothing more than a discrete bundle of aggregates. So David Hume, the philosopher, was a very famous pioneer of the bundle theory of self. So he says, when he observed most intimately into what you call yourself, all he noticed are fleeting perceptions, sensations, and impressions, and so forth. Now, the Buddhist, the common Buddhist interpretation of no self takes that bounded self that I've just described and gives it and says it's nothing more than this bundle. And instead of what Hume was talking about, they talk about the Buddhist, like the five aggregates: form, feeling, perceptions, mental formation, and consciousness. They're all discrete elements that go to create this illusion of a unified, bounded, persisting self. So the conception of self is in fact the same one, but there's a disagreement between, I suppose, myself and my non-self, and the standard Buddhist interpretation as to how that illusion gets constructed. So I think that the illusion, it's why I call it, it's called, the subtext of the book is called the two-tiered illusion of self. What actually creates this bounded thinker of thoughts, doer of deeds, this persisting thing, is both this witness consciousness, which is this unconditioned, unified sense of presence, which is impersonal, that it gets combined with the Tanha driven, that's like the desire, craving driven thoughts and emotions, so that it's as if the witness consciousness gets appropriated by these thoughts and then turned into this sense of a bounded self. So the inputs into the illusory self, according to the two-tiered self model, are both the unconstructed, the witness consciousness, which isn't illusory, and also the bundle of everything. And the bundle isn't illusory itself, but that goes in to create this illusion of the separate bounded self. Whereas the bundle theory, they say, no, the illusion doesn't have this feeder of unconstructed, real witness consciousness. It's thoroughly illusory. Okay. That's the difference.
Okay. So let me see if I understand this. As you said, Hume said, well, actually, this thing I think of myself, if you look at it closely, it's actually just a lot of little things.
Yes,
like there's
yes.
a feeling here, there's this here, and the same is true as you follow it through time. I think he would say. I mean, he might say it's like a movie. If you look closely, well, an old film movie at least, where it's actually distinct frames, but if you run them by real quick, they look like a movie. I think Hume would say, in this temporal sense as well, the continuity is kind of illusory.
He would, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, and what you're saying is, and so that's often taken as like basically a version of the Buddhist concept of not self. And I think you're saying, no, actually, the sense of continuity and the sense of coherence, it's not a complete illusion. Because at the level of pure awareness, this witness consciousness things, these are actual properties of witness consciousness. There is continuity. It's the illusion comes in the relationship of that to the aggregates, to the lots of little things that Hume would talk about. So I think you'd say there's a kind of truth in his saying that, well, all these lots of little things aren't as unified as they seem, and they don't really constitute a self, fine. But you're saying there is a kind of unity at the level of pure kind of consciousness or awareness that is not an illusion.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah.
And has this... Have you gotten blowback from people who say you've got it all wrong, or?
Oh yeah, I've been scolded many times.
Yeah.
I remember once at a conference at breakfast, I was getting scolded in stereo to very nice people, both philosophers that I was getting it in. One would tell me off, and then the other would tell me off. And generally, yeah.
Is there argument that your interpretation of Buddhism is wrong? Because I think what you're saying is that your view of this is actually a legitimate interpretation of Buddhist text. Are they saying you've got that wrong, or are they saying, look, you've just got the metaphysics wrong, or whatever? It's like this couldn't be the case.
No, it's a former. It's about my interpretation of Buddhism, but I've yet to really see a good reply to my arguments.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had the same experience with all of my arguments.
Yeah, and I had this other interesting, and it's worth sort of pointing this sort of aspect out, and I put it to some of these very nice people, but who were on a different page with the interpretation. And it's that in Buddhist they talk about the ultimate goal is Nirvana, and then what happens when the Arahant dies? So in Buddhist cosmology, normally when we die, there's this idea we're reborn according to our karma and sort of various circumstances. And so according to this sort of whole Buddhist cosmology, when the Arahant dies, they're not reborn again. That's the end. There's no more rebirths. And this is totally taking it from the point of view of somebody who's adhering to Buddhism. And so imagine then that on their view, if we're nothing but the five aggregates, then when the Arahant, the enlightened person, dies, that's it. It's complete annihilation. And so I put it to them that if there is nothing else besides these conditioned aggregates, it's just annihilation. Why does the Buddha speak as if it's such a wonderful, marvelous, the best possible thing that could ever happen to one is to attain Nibbana? Why, if one's just going to die and it's just going to be complete, the end of everything? And then the reply is, well, it's just that they're so happy as an Arahant that it's worth it. It makes it worth it. And I said, well, what if they only live for 5 minutes?
Right.
It's still worth it. 2 minutes, 1 minute, 5 seconds. And so a 5-second existence as an Arahant makes everything worth it, even if they completely annihilate. And then I saw in another blog, somebody said, well, what's the difference between that, the Arahant, if that's all there is to them, dying, and just a normal materialist view, which just says when we die, well, that's it, blotting. And
now, let me get clear. Are these people Are these people who are arguing that to attain nirvana is to more or less immediately cease to have subjective experience?
No.
Okay, they're talking about life after death.
Yeah, it's on the view of life after death. Okay. But this is also sort of an argument for life after death or not. But it's pointing out that as an interpretation of Buddhism, right, it seems vastly implausible that the Buddha would have thought that Nibbana and Parinibbana, the death right, of the Arahant, right, was such a wonderful thing if it only meant annihilation. Right. It just makes no sense.
Parinirvana is your state after death if you have attained nirvana during life.
Yes, that's...
Okay, now, so related to all this, so you think to focus on this business of the self kind of internally being an actually unbundled thing that just seems bundled is to miss the heart of the not-self teaching. What you think is the heart of the not-self teaching, I gather, is the idea that your self has these bounds, right? That you are this unique and clearly distinct thing.
Exactly, yeah. So it's what's meant by self, the way it's been defined, I think, in the suttas is as this thing which is intrinsically bounded. So the illusion is that one's consciousness, one's awareness, witness consciousness, is intrinsically confined to a perspective. So but the analogy might help. So it's imagining that, say somebody grew up all their life in a very small room. They might think that it's the intrinsic nature of space to be confined to the shape and size of the room. Mm-hmm. That is the nature of space. When they leave the room for the first time, they realize, hey, it's not the intrinsic nature. When I come back to the room, it's extrinsically. It looks the shape of the room, but I realize it's not the nature of space to be the shape of the room. So analogously, on my interpretation, the consciousness, our illusion is that it's intrinsically bound through this particular psychophysical perspective called me, and we identify as the owner of it. But for one who has had purportedly an enlightened experience, it's like they have attained a mode of consciousness, objectless consciousness, and they realize, in fact, it's not intrinsically bound to this perspective. So even when they come back as an arahant through the perspective and seeing things through the five senses, through psychophysical, spatiotemporal perspective, they realize it's not the intrinsic nature of consciousness to be bound to this perspective, any more than it's the intrinsic nature of space to be the shape of a room.
So, I've heard people who have attained great meditative depths. I'm convinced they actually have. And I've heard a couple of them describe the experience of not-self this way. I don't think this is actually classic Buddhist teaching. They're just saying it's the way it feels, mm-hmm. which is that they feel that awareness or consciousness is almost just a property of the universe or like a field, and mm-hmm. their experience is just a particular point of access to it, kind of. Does mm-hmm. that resonate with...
Oh, very much. Yes, it resonates also with the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which I have a lot of sympathy with.
Which is associated with Hinduism.
Yeah, and I think Hinduism is given very bad rep by Buddhists. Always hearing it being put down.
There's a surprising amount of tribalism I've discovered in when I hear some Buddhists talk about Hindu philosophy. Yes.
Yeah, and the Hindus don't tend to do it, but the Buddhists do it. Yes, but though one has to be careful because even where I've read the accounts of arahants in both the Hindu tradition, in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, like Nisargadatta Maharaj and Ramana Maharshi, and also purported arahants in the Buddhist tradition, such as Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Chah, and they all say that one does get to a stage where there's the experiences of a very subtle universal consciousness that's sort of pervading everything. But as I understand it, and seems to be what they all say, is that you go beyond even that. Mm-hmm. You go beyond even that to which is just literally indescribable. The best can be said it's an awareness or infinite potentiality, non-manifest, and again, the words are sort of like fingers pointing at the moon. You can't really conceptualize it because the words have been functioned to describe things in the world. Mm-hmm. But it's even beyond almost beyond a universal consciousness. Again, I'm just going by what they have said, and right. That's who I take to be the authorities on this, rather than scholars. There's the Buddhist suttas and those who have been widely acclaimed as having attained Nirvana.
Right. So. And you know, on the one hand, I acknowledge that it sounds kind of New Age and woo and wacky to say, well, there's a universal field of consciousness. On the other hand, in my view, consciousness is a sufficiently mystifying problem, which I think some philosophers just literally don't get. And here I will not mention any names like Dan Dennett's, for example. But they just literally don't...
He's explained consciousness.
Oh, I forgot. They just literally don't understand what the problem is. And I think if you do understand what the problem, how profound the problem is, that beings would have this subjective awareness thing, I think you have to be open to the possibility of slightly weird sounding realities being the case. And I don't mean weird, but I mean weird.
Yeah, well, in fact, I mean, to be fair with philosophers, I think they really do feel what they call the hard problem of consciousness, or the explanatory gap, which is just, why is it that a particular neural state feels like that if it is identical? No one would ask, well, why does a particular function of the brain, such as learning, have these particular neural configurations? I mean, it may be difficult to understand, but it's not... There seems to be a sense to it, but when it comes to the hard problem of, like, why should something feel like this? Why should a particular brain state have a unified kind of conscious field? I mean, philosophers really do. There is a lot of diversion in the different kind of positions, and I think the philosophers really do feel the force of it. Say David Chalmers.
Well, I certainly don't mean that all of them don't, but I really do think that some philosophers and some non-philosophers who opine on it and write books about it do not understand the problem. But sorry, and I shouldn't be mean.
But it is interesting, though, but just on that sort of universal consciousness, it's actually gaining more and more traction, the view of panpsychism in analytical philosophy, the view... So Galen Strawson, for instance, has a very good paper on that idea that particles can be conscious. Mm-hmm. I think it's quite a compelling argument, and so it's being taken more and more seriously. So it's not as wacky as one might think, actually.
And this neuroscientist, Christoph Koch, has I think spoken favorably about panpsychism at times.
I'm not that familiar with his work.
And I think it's not the case that all forms of panpsychism are exactly what we've just described, but it's kind of moving vaguely in that direction. Okay, so one other thing, when I taught this MOOC on Buddhism and psychology this semester, and I hadn't actually read your book at that point, but I made this distinction that I think maps onto to your distinction when I described two different kinds of experiences of not self, and I called them the interior experience and the exterior experience. And what I meant was that the interior experience is like seeing your emotions and so on and not identifying with them, just observing them dispassionately. And that has certain implications and certain very important kind of therapeutic implications. And by the exterior version of not self, I meant the sense that, which I've had an inkling of in meditation on retreats, the sense that the bounds, your skin, the things you normally think of as the bounds of yourself are more permeable than you might imagine. And specifically, like the feeling which I've had that, like, okay, I've got this tingling in my foot, and I'm hearing this bird out there, and suddenly, like in day 6 of a meditation retreat, it's not so clear how the tingling is any more a part of me than the bird is. Both of them my awareness of them consists of signals being sent up in this, you know, and it so happens that in one case the signal is coming within this envelope of skin, you know, my foot, and in one case without the bird, but there's just this feeling that the distinction we normally make there is actually arbitrary, okay, and so that kind of feeling where you start doubting the bounds of self, I called the exterior version of not self, and then the former kind, the interior. And I think, well, I'll go on to the next part later, but that kind of maps on to the, and I gather you're arguing that it's the exterior experience of not self that is more at the heart of Buddhist teaching.
No, I actually really like that distinction. I might use it. Yeah, that I don't know if I would want to make to say that the internal one's relation to one's emotions. Perhaps it's a cause and effect thing. So as one identifies with emotions and sort of as a me, then that emphasizes and exaggerates and amplifies the sense of separation one has from the world. So if there's something I really want and I can't get it, there's an automatic visceral sense of separation from it. And when you talk about the exterior, that is like a way that it's borne out, kind of like one's, it's like getting at the same thing but from different angles. I wouldn't say that they're fundamentally different. Like so that a manifestation of boundedness is through one's emotions. Another manifestation of boundedness is through the exterior. And it actually reminds me quite a lot of a TED talk, a really remarkable TED talk I had by Jill Bolte-Taylor. You probably have come across it as Stroke of Insight. And she does have that experience like of the exterior, of not being able to tell where her arm ends and the shower wall begins during this stroke. You're just seeing the almost like the atom as an atomic level. So it does buy into this idea that the source of the illusion of self isn't unity, but it's the boundedness.
Right.
So
I take your point that the sense of separation from others. I mean, what I was going to say is, one thing I think is interesting is that the sense of the bounded self, which you're saying is an illusion, and the illusion, the idea that it's an illusion is at the heart of Buddhist teaching, has clear moral implications. I mean, if you start doubting that your own interests are more important than other people's interests, that has, clear implications. And I take your point that the conviction, that your interests are so important has very much to do with what I call the interior version of not self, which is to say your identification with your emotions, which of course were designed by natural selection to serve this one organism's interests. So that's a good, I think I see your point that the distinction I'm talking about doesn't map exactly onto the distinction you're making, but it's relevant to it.
It's definitely relevant, and yes, it definitely does have the moral implications as well. Although, interestingly, Buddhism doesn't have to put things in terms of immoral language. It's like a useful way to put things, but it sort of talks about cause and effect. Like if you act from these motivations, there'll be these results, and it's not. The moral stuff is an artificial layering that can be put on it.
Right. I mean, eventually, if we go too far down this path, we'll wind up grappling with the question of whether Buddhism is nihilistic, and we should probably save that for a later conversation. But it's true that I've talked to people who seemed close enough to enlightenment that among the dichotomies they had transcended was the dichotomy between kind of good and bad, which didn't mean they had become horrible people, because the interesting thing is they had lost the motivation to do what we would call bad things in the course of ceasing to see the world in terms of good and bad. Yes,
and in the course of losing the sense of self. So remember, the sense of self on the Buddhist theory goes with the greed, hatred, and delusion, and that's the source of a lot of what we call immoral behavior. So it would follow that as one loses those tendencies, towards grasping and pushing away, and is not emotionally invested in things being one way or another. A lot of the immoral behavior would just naturally lessen and then die out with the illusion of self. So it's a very interesting question. Is our mind actually constituted naturally that way, such that this could be a conceivably plausible process, or do you actually need a certain amount of selfishness to stay alive? And that's from the evolutionary side. That's what people argue. Yeah.
And this partly has to do with the notion of judgment. I mean, mindfulness meditation in theory could make you less judgmental in a number of senses, right? And ultimately, one of them could be being less inclined to make moral judgments about other people, which, after all, are often not reliable anyway. In my experience. But okay, so finally, we've been talking a while. I just wanted to ask you. You mentioned the work of Antonio Damasio in your book pretty prominentely, and you think it's very relevant to the arguments you're making. And I'm actually not that familiar with the work. I've known for years I should read Descartes' Error. I haven't read it. Can you tell us what the kind of the essence of his work is that relates to your own work?
Okay, so the book I really drew on was the feeling of what happens. And
is that after Descartes' Error?
That's after Descartes' Error. That's his one. It came out in 1999. Okay. And I think he's written a more recent version since then. But how it's relevant is that he gives a really convincing account of how the sense of self arises, both diachronically, that's in terms of evolutionary theory, the kind of pressures on our organism to develop a sense of self, and also synchronically, that is, at a time, the particular emotions and impressions, how that feeds into this sense of a boundary. So those are the elements. Now, there are elements where I disagree with Damasio, but that's really what I took from him. And he seems to be very solid empirically, and although what he's making is a hypothesis or a conjecture, it seems to me very intelligent and detailed take on the source of the sense of the self in terms of its boundary.
So I should read Damasio.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Anything else you want to say that we've failed to get at about your argument or Buddhism or anything?
I'll probably think of something 2 minutes after the end of the talk.
Okay. Well,
not for now. My mind is blank.
In that event, maybe we can have another conversation down the road. Once you remember what it was. Okay. Well, thanks so much, and good luck with your meditation and your work.
Thanks so much, Bob, and good luck with your own work. It sounds very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.